All righty. So day one of Anatomy and Physiology, PFT 118 here, we are looking at the organization of the human body. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to cover a little bit of like what the various different body studies are, you know, the anatomy versus the physiology. We'll talk about how we sort of organize things, work our way into body directions, which is really fun. So we're going to talk about like the anatomic position, a lot of directional terms, and the 3 planes of motion. When I say anatomic position, basically that's literally understanding like how we label everything. We always label everything in a very simple way. That way, there's never an argument between like what is up and what is down. You know, like, have you ever seen this meme, 6 versus 9 comic perspective? So if you've ever seen like this picture here, right? Anatomists hate this meme. You know, it says this person says it's 6, this person says 9. So just because you're right doesn't mean I'm wrong. You haven't seen it from my side. So an anatomist would say, nope, that is absolutely not true. One of those things is actually correct. And what they mean is like from the anatomic position, you know, this would be labeled either up or down, right? So you would actually, I'd be like, no, 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 no. Right? So like somebody standing on their head, you know, say they're doing like a handstand and their feet are in the sky, their hands are on the floor, I would still say that their feet are considered superior, which is a point above a point of reference. And that sounds weird because obviously the feet are really, oh my God, I just said superior. That is the reverse of what I would say. I would say the feet are inferior because they are below everything else in the body. Your feet are as inferior as it gets. They're the lowest part, right? Whereas your head is the most superior, even though you're you know in this position here. And the reason why is because from the anatomic position, that's how those things are. So we're going to discover the anatomic position and we're going to label that out and make it very clear. We'll talk a little bit about our directional terms as well. So we'll talk about when something is on the front side of the body, we call that anterior, or when it's on the posterior side, we call that, you know, that's the back side. And then very briefly, we'll talk a little bit about metabolism. We'll talk a little bit about body cavities. These areas here are not super vital to us. You know, obviously like metabolism is huge. When we talk about like catabolic reactions versus anabolic reactions, that is very big because obviously if we're trying to build muscle, we want to be in an anabolic state rather than a catabolic one. So we do want to understand the general bits of that, but we're not going to dive too heavy into metabolism today. So what we are sort of looking at here is the study of anatomy and physiology, right? That is going to be our course for the next 12 sort of classes here. So when I say anatomy, what do I mean? Well, anatomy is simply just the study of body structures, the study of what stuff is. It's how we label things, right? This is my face. It is where I convey all of my emotions, you know. That is the anatomy, right? The second part, the what it does, I would convey all this or that, right? That's sort of the physiology of things, right? Physiology is the study of the body's function, right? So like your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets, the water that's in your blood, right? Which we call plasma, right? All of those like components, they each get their own like individual name. That's the anatomy, right? The physiology is like, well, they do different things. The red blood cells deliver oxygen and glucose and things like that around the body. The platelets are going to help, you know, with clotting and things like that. White blood cells are going to help fight off any like viruses or bacterias. And then plasma makes it easier for us to like kind of move, you know, certain materials around, you know, it makes the blood a little bit more viscous and easy to pump and things like that. So that's the anatomy is like what it is. The physiology is what it does. Or to give you an example that's very relevant to our jobs as personal trainers, you've got your muscular system, you've got your skeletal system, you've got your nervous system, right? So the skeletal system is going to give us the framework. The muscular system is going to manipulate that framework. And the nervous system is going to control all of that. Right. So the nervous system controls the muscular system to move the skeletal system. So that's the physiology, right? It's what the body does. Anatomy is sort of what the body is. And And then there is also pathology. You know, the way we were talking about white blood cells working a minute ago, that would be pathology. That's the study of diseases, which is something we do talk about as trainers, although our job is not necessarily to directly treat any diseases or conditions. A lot of times what we do is we improve the general health of an individual, which results in improvements in those diseases. But we don't necessarily treat them directly. You know, like we'll have clients, like you will probably, I can almost guarantee it because it happens to pretty much most trainers. So many people have it. You will probably have a client with diabetes, and then they will probably get their blood sugar under control while working with you. And then they don't really need to take insulin anymore. Did you cure diabetes? Definitely not. That is definitely not what we're going to say there. But you improve someone's general health, and then they no longer have blood sugar issues. So that is sort of, we do it through like indirect sort of general health improvements when it comes to pathology. So we do need to have an understanding of these diseases if we're going to talk about that. We've got really briefly, just because we are going to do a little bit of chemistry here and there, talking about the levels of organization inside your body. Some of the stuff we're going to talk about when we talk about anatomy and physiology is going to come all the way down to chemicals, right? And those are going to be the smallest, simplest things that we talk about, which is ironic to say, considering that chemistry is often the most complicated thing to talk about. But they are actually the simplest because they're literally just little chemicals bonded together that we use to kind of break apart to maybe release their energy, and that gives us like the energy to do all of our stuff. But you are made out of bajillions of chemicals, all kind of coming together, all of these atoms coming together to kind of make up your body, right? And they all sort of form themselves in different ways. You know, for instance, like amino acids make up the proteins in your skin, right? Carbohydrates come together to make up the stored glycogen you've got in your body. Fats make up your cell walls, you know? And those are just talking about, you know, 3 specific types of chemicals that we get from food and stuff. What about all the vitamins? What about all the minerals? What about all the other stuff? You know, there's definitely a lot of other materials there. But if you take a whole bunch of chemicals and you put them together, you end up with a human cell, you know? Most of you, where's my picture of that actually? It's coming up way down the line. That's way far away. Most of you, if you look at like the various chemicals in the human body, you are mostly like water, water is definitely going to be the thing that kind of makes up most of you. In that water, there's a lot of oxygen, right? It's H2O, right? There's a whole bunch of oxygen. So 65% of you is going to be oxygen, and the remaining 10% is hydrogen. So that's 75% water right there off the bat. You got a little bit of carbon, making up a lot of your body. Carbon is this really cool element that likes to bond to lots of stuff, making new pieces of you. You're only 3% nitrogen, which might not sound that crazy to you, but for my students who have been through nutrition, you look at us and you're like, oh, that's a lot of protein, and it is. But like, it's only 3% of your overall body weight is nitrogen, which is crazy, right? Amino acids have nitrogen in them. So all the proteins in your body, you'd think that there'd be a lot higher than that. And then there's all the other stuff. You've got little bits of calcium, you get all these rocks and metals making up your body, like potassium, you're made up of a little bit of sulfur. Sodium, you're made up of a little bit of chlorine, the stuff that cleans pools. That's kind of weird to think about. Magnesium, all kinds of really interesting minerals out there. So, like I said, we are mostly water for sure, but you take all those chemicals and it makes up all of our cells. Now, when you group up a bunch of cells together, you end up with something slightly more complicated, right? A whole bunch of chemicals come together, it gets a little more complicated. You get your cells, take a whole bunch of cells, put them together, it gets a little bit more complicated. We end up with like a tissue, right? So a tissue might be like talking about like muscle tissue, for instance, right? So like muscle tissue is very unique because it has the muscle cells have all these really cool little proteins in them that allow them to do something that no other types of tissues can do, right? They can contract and they can relax, which is awesome, So thanks to all that muscle tissue, we can do really cool contractions. Thanks to our cardiac tissue, which is mostly muscle as well. It just looks a little bit different. We're able to continually beat our heart. Your brain tissue is made up of lots of neurons. And so like when a bunch of cells come together, so in a muscle, that would be like a bunch of muscle cells, we call those muscle fibers, come together, you end up with muscle tissue. Put enough of that together and you end up with a full organ. So a bunch of tissue comes together, we end up with an organ. An organ is what your individual muscles are. You know, when we think of organs, we think of the stomach, we think of the heart, the lungs, right? Your liver, your spleen. You know, you think about all those like individual pieces. But from an anatomic perspective, every single one of your individual muscles counts as its own organ. Every one of your single individual bones counts as its own organ, you know, because a bone is made up of a whole bunch of like bone cells coming together to make up bone tissue. And then when there's enough bone tissue and you get a whole complete bone, that's an organ by definition. So that's kind of fun, right? Now, the really cool part is where all those organs come together to function as a group. So you end up with an organ system. And an organ system would be like your entire digestive system. You have all these different organs that all do different things. They often all have like multiple jobs, and they all kind of work together, right? You know, you've got your stomach, which dissolves everything, your small intestine, which is going to absorb everything, your large intestine, which is going to absorb everything that's left. And then everything exits out of the body with, you know, the other organs, your waste system and stuff, right? Your nervous system, right? You've got your brain, which is an individual organ. You've got your spinal column, right? And then all the nerves that are kind of branching out from there and all the tracks that are kind of coming back, right? Like all of that, that is all like kind of working together to give you a nervous system. And your nervous system, like we just said a second ago, works with your muscular system. And so like your muscular system is all the muscles coming together. So your nervous system zaps the muscular system. It causes movement, right? And so it manipulates that all around. So that's where it all comes together. When you put a whole bunch of systems together, we end up with you. We end up with the organism, right? We are comprised of a digestive system, which is probably the first thing that develops in the human body. Then we get a nervous system. Way down the line, we start to develop a muscular system so that our nervous system has something to control. We get like our, you know, meanwhile, all of our bones are sort of growing and giving us like a framework and stuff. So like you are made up of all of these different systems all coming together, you know? And that is sort of how we think of the levels of organization. So not hugely, like this is not the kind of thing you're going to be tested on. Like I'm not going to ask you about the levels of organization really. You're not going to see that on your NASM test, but I love to take a minute to talk about that because like it's so cool to see how everything kind of builds up, and it really gives us a good understanding of one of my favorite concepts. If you ever want to understand anatomy, you want to understand physiology just a little bit better, you just have to remember this thing right here. Form follows function. I typed it in backwards, actually. So form follows function. And what I mean by that is that stuff is shaped very specifically so that it can perform very specifically, right? This is kind of funny because you look at like, you know, this is like an architect. We always think about like architects. They're like the ones who kind of took this. And then anatomists were like, oh, that's perfect. We're going to take that, you know, like took that term. So when I say like form follows function, is like basically things have to be shaped a certain way so that they can do certain things, right? We as an organism needed to have a muscular system to move around our bones, right? But we also needed our bones to be able to like have something to manipulate. Because if you didn't have a skeletal system, your muscles would just kind of quiver and you'd just be this like empty sack of flesh that wouldn't be able to really move around, you know, maybe a little bit, but not very effectively for sure. So, you know, the function that we needed to have, it's like, oh, well, we need to have like some hard levers running throughout the body to sort of manipulate things. And that is where our skeletal system kind of came in, right? So I love to take just a minute to talk about that because like understanding how like form follows function is a really big part of just looking at anatomy and physiology. We have very specific anatomy so that we can perform very specific physiology. And the reason I love that so much is because we're trainers, right? Well, if you want to build a very specific looking body, you need to give it a very specific type of stress, because you will not get that body unless you give it the right type of stress. Usain Bolt did not become the fastest man in the world by running marathons. It didn't make any sense for him to do long distance running. That form and that function are two totally different things, right? Whereas like we saw an athlete in a totally different sport the other night. I was just talking about this last night, but we saw, what's her name? We just saw Erin Jackson. She just won Olympic gold here in women's speed skating, right? Which is awesome. She was she started training in like 2018. Like for the first time, but she was a professional like inline like rollerblader before that. So rollerblading transferred very well into speed skating. If you took, who's a top of the line athlete right now, like at the beginning of their career, if you took Patrick Mahomes, wonderful athlete, incredible athlete, and tried to make him an Olympic speed skater in 5 years, like he's not going to do it. Like he'll probably be pretty decent, with lots of training and stuff. But it's not a transferable skill. The function doesn't follow the form. So that's what I kind of want to look at there. So before we dive any further into that, I did want to show you guys a video that explains this concept very, very well. It's going to kind of set us up for the rest of this course here. Here we go. This is literally the first episode of Crash Course here. So I like to show these Crash Course videos all the time because they do such good animations that really just show exactly what I'm saying. And also like he gives a pretty good breakdown himself. We'll put the closed captioning on. So yeah, here we go. Let's put me up in the corner here. All right, so here's a little video explaining the basics of anatomy and physiology.
I'd like you to take a second and really look at yourself. I don't mean take stock of your life, which really isn't any of my business, but I mean just look at your body. Hold up your hand. Wiggle it around, take a sip of water, hold your breath, sniff the air. These things are so simple for most of us that we don't give them a moment's thought, but each one of those things is so much more complex than it feels. Every movement you make, every new day that you live to see is the result of a collection of systems working together to function properly. In short, you, my friend, are a magnificent beast. You are more convoluted and prolific and polymorphously awesome than you probably even dare to think. For instance, did you know that if they were all stretched out, your intestines would be about as long as a 3-story building is tall? Or that by the time you reach old age, you'll have produced enough saliva to fill more than one swimming pool? Or that you lose about 2/3 of a kilogram every year in dead skin cells, and you will lose more than 50 kilograms of them in your lifetime. Just tiny, dried up pieces of you, drifting around your house and settling on your bookshelves, feeding entire colonies of dust mites. You're your own little world, and I'm here to help you get to know that world, the body that you call a home, through the twin disciplines of anatomy, the study of the structure and relationships between body parts, and physiology, the science of how those parts come together to function and keep that body alive. Anatomy is all about what your body is, physiology is about what it does, and together they comprise the science of us. It's complicated science, I'm not gonna lie to you, and it draws on a lot of other disciplines like chemistry and even physics. And you'll have to absorb a lot of new terms, lots of Latin, gobs of Greek. But this course isn't just gonna be an inventory of your individual parts or a diagram of how a slice of pizza gives you energy, because these disciplines are really about why you're alive right now and how you came to be alive, how disease harms you and how your body recovers from illness and injury. It's about the big picture stuff that we either spend most of our time thinking about or trying not to think about. Death and sex and eating and sleeping and even the act of thinking itself. All processes that we can understand through anatomy and physiology. If you pay attention, and if I do my job well enough, you'll come out of this course with a richer, more complete understanding not only of how your body works, everything from handshakes to heart attacks, but I think you'll also start to see that you really are more than just the sum of your parts. We've come to understand the living body by studying a lot of dead ones, and for a long time we did this mostly in secret. For centuries, the dissection of human bodies was very taboo in many societies, and as a result, the study of anatomy has followed a long and slow and often creepy road. The 2nd century Greek physician Galen gleaned what he could about the human form by performing vivisections on pigs. Da Vinci poked around in dead bodies while sketching his beautifully detailed anatomical drawings until the Pope made him stop. It wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that certified anatomists were allowed to perform tightly regulated human dissections, and they were so popular that they were often public events with admission fees attended by the likes of Michelangelo and Rembrandt. The study of human anatomy became such a craze in Europe that grave robbing became a lucrative, if not legal, occupation, until 1832 when Britain passed the Anatomy Act, which provided students with plentiful corpses in the form of executed murderers. Today, students of anatomy and physiology still use educational cadavers to learn in person and hands-on what's inside a human body by dissecting them. And it's totally legal. The cadavers are volunteers, which is what people mean when they say that they're donating their body to science. So what have all these dead bodies shown us? Well, one big idea that we see over and over again is that the function of a cell, or an organ, or a whole organism always reflects its form. Blood flows in one direction through your heart simply because its valves prevent it from flowing backward. In the same way, your bones are strong and hard, and this allows them to protect and support all your soft parts. The basic idea that what a structure can do depends on its specific form is called the complementarity of structure and function. And it holds true through every level of your body's organization, from cell to tissue to system. And it all begins with the smallest of the small. Just like the chair you're sitting on, you are just a conglomeration of atoms. About 7 octillion of them, to be precise. Fortunately for both of us here, we've covered the basics of chemistry that every incoming physiology student needs to know in Crash Course Chemistry, so I'll be referring you there throughout the course when it comes to how things work at the atomic level. But the next level up from the chemistry of atoms and molecules includes the smallest units of living things, cells. All cells have some basic functions in common, but they also vary widely in size and shape depending on their purpose. For example, one of the smallest cells in your body is the red blood cell, which measures about 5 micrometers across. Now contrast that with the single motor neuron that runs the length of your entire leg from your big toe to the bottom of your spine, about a meter from end to end. Typically, cells group with similar cells to form the next level of organization. Tissues like muscles, membranes and cavity linings, nervous and connective tissues. When 2 or more tissue types combine, they form organs. The heart, liver, lungs, skin, and etc. that perform specific functions to keep the body running. Organs work together and combine to get things done, forming organ systems. It's how, like, the liver and stomach and intestines of your digestive system all unite to take that burrito from plate to pooper. And finally, all those previous levels combine to form the highest level of organization, the body itself. Me and you and your dog, we're all glorious, complete organisms made from the precise organization of trillions of cells in nearly constant activity. This ability of all living systems to maintain stable internal conditions no matter what changes are occurring outside the body is called homeostasis, and it's another major unifying theme in anatomy and physiology. Your survival is all about maintaining balance of both materials and energy. You need the right amount of blood, water, nutrients, and oxygen to create and disperse energy, as well as the perfect body temperature, the right blood pressure, the efficient movement of waste through your body. All that needs to stay balanced. And by your survival depending on it, I mean that everyone's ultimate cause of death is the extreme and irreversible loss of homeostasis. Organ failure, hypothermia, suffocation, starvation, dehydration, they all lead to the same end by throwing off your internal balances that allow your body to keep processing energy. Take an extreme and sudden case. Your arm pops off. If nothing is done quickly to treat such a severe wound, you would bleed to death, right? But what does that really mean? What's gonna happen? How do I die? Well, that arterial wound, if left untreated, will cause a drastic drop in blood pressure that in turn will prevent the delivery of oxygen throughout the body. So the real result of such an injury, the actual cause of death, is the loss of homeostasis. I mean, you can live a full and healthy life without an arm, but you can't live without blood pressure, because without blood, your cells don't get oxygen, and without oxygen, they can't process energy, and you die. With so many connected parts needed to make your life possible, you can see how we need a hyper-precise language to identify the parts of your body and communicate what's happening to them. A doctor isn't going to recommend a patient for surgery by telling the surgeon that the patient has an achy belly. They're going to need to give a detailed description. Essentially, it's like a verbal map. So over time, anatomy has developed its own standardized set of directional terms that describe where one body part is in relation to another. Imagine a person standing in front of you. This is what is called the classic anatomical position, where the body is erect and facing straight ahead with arms at the sides and palms forward. Now imagine slicing that person into different sections, or planes. Don't imagine it too graphically, though. The sagittal plane comes down vertically and divides a body or organ in left and right parts. If you imagine a plane parallel to the sagittal plane, but off to one side, that plane is the parasagittal. The coronal or frontal plane splits everything vertically into front and back, and the transverse or horizontal plane divides the body top and bottom. Look at that body again, and you'll notice even more divisions, like the difference between the axial and appendicular parts. Everything in line with the center of the body, the head, neck, and trunk, are considered axial parts, while the arms and legs, or appendages, are the appendicular parts that attach to the body's axis. Everything in the front of your body is considered anterior or ventral, and everything in the back is posterior or dorsal. So your eyes are anterior and your butt is posterior. But you'd also say that your breastbone is anterior to or in front of the spine, and the heart is posterior to or behind the breastbone. Features toward the top of your body, like your head, are considered superior or cranial, while structures that are lower down are inferior or caudal. So the jaw is superior to the lungs because it's above them, while the pelvis is inferior to the stomach because it's below it. And there's more! If you imagine a center line running down the axis of a body, structures toward that midline are called medial, while those farther away from the midline are lateral. So the arms are lateral to the heart, and the heart is medial to the arms. Looking at the limbs, your appendicular parts of your body, you'd call the areas closer to the center of the trunk proximal, and those farther away distal. In anatomy talk, your knee is proximal to your ankle because it's closer to the axial line, while a wrist is distal to the elbow because it's farther from the center. Okay. So pop quiz. I'm eating a club sandwich. I'm not. I wish I was. But imagine I am. I'm so ravenous and distracted that I forget to take out the little frilly toothpick at the top, and I end up swallowing it with a raft of turkey bacon and toast. A fragment of that toothpick gets lodged somewhere in here, and my doctor takes an x-ray and says I need surgery. Using anatomical language, how would she direct the surgeon to that tiny wooden stake inside of me? She might describe it as being along the medial line, posterior to the heart, but anterior to the vertebra, inferior to the collarbone, but superior to the stomach. That would give the surgeon a pretty good idea of where to look, in the esophagus, just above the stomach. I warned you at the beginning. A lot of terms, but all those terms might just save my life. And hey, it's the end of your first lesson, and you've already started to talk the talk. Today you learned that anatomy studies the structure of body parts, while physiology describes how those parts come together to function. We also talked about some of these disciplines' central principles, including the complementarity of structure and function, the hierarchy of organization, and how the balance of materials and energy, known as homeostasis, is really what keeps you alive. And then we wrapped it all up with a primer on directional terms, all held together with a toothpick. Thank you for watching, especially to our Subbable subscribers who make Crash Course available not just to themselves, but also everyone else in the world. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to Subbable.com. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DiPestino, and our consultant is Dr. Brandon Jackson. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins, the script supervisor is Valerie Barr, the sound designer is Michael Aranda, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so a lot of stuff going on there. For sure. Let's go ahead and take a look at the stuff that is sort of most relevant to us. So like we said, there are going to be a lot of different body systems. You know, you've got your integumentary system, which is like your skin and stuff. You've got your skeletal system giving us a framework. You get your muscular system that moves that framework. You've got your nervous system, you know, transmitting signals around and like communicating with your entire body. Your endocrine system, which is your hormones that works with your nervous system to sort of control the body. Cardiovascular system, which pumps materials around. Lymphatic system, which pumps materials around. You know, they just both kind of do that in different ways. We get the respiratory system extracting oxygen to give us energy eventually. The digestive system extracting energy in a very different means through food. Urinary system, which is sort of eliminating all the waste from those other two. We get the reproductive system, which is everybody's favorite. We get a lot of different systems kind of coming around to like give us sort of metabolism and all this stuff. So that is sort of where we are headed throughout the rest of this course. We're going to look at the most relevant systems to our industry and work our way through those. So as we're looking at it, one of the big things that we got to talk about to understand how our body is functioning is metabolism, right? So when I say metabolism, we're going to take a much more scientific approach to that definition. A lot of times people hear metabolism and they think, oh, it's how many calories you burn in a day, or oh, it's how hungry you feel throughout the day, right? It's like, oh, that guy's got a fast metabolism, so he's always hungry, right? That is, that's true to a point, but it's not exactly like the most scientific breakdown because it's forgetting a lot of other parts of metabolism. So we're going to be a little bit more specific about it. Metabolism is going to refer to any and all life-sustaining reactions. If it's a chemical reaction taking place inside your body, we're going to call that metabolism, right? So we're going to split metabolism as all life, any chemical reaction taking place in your body. We're going to split it down into two major categories. We're either going to have catabolism, which are catabolic reactions, which is the part of your metabolism that breaks stuff down, right? So like, I had my coffee just a minute ago, right? And so that is going to have like, I like to have like cream and sugar in my coffee, right? So that's going to have some proteins in the milk. It's going to have a lot of sugars in it from the milk as well. A little bit of sugar in the coffee itself. And then all the coffee is going to have like caffeine and glucose molecules and things like that. And I got a little bit of fat in that cream as well. So those proteins, fats, and carbs need to be broken down into their individual components if I'm going to absorb them. And so that's what catabolic reactions are. Catabolic reactions are taking something very complex and breaking it down into something very simple. Carbohydrates get broken down into glucose molecules, proteins get broken down into amino acids, and fats kind of just get broken down into like smaller fats, which we would just call like a lipid at that point. So catabolic reactions break stuff down. So if you took a chicken breast, right, your body can't like a lot of times people think the way like nutrition works is like you go do a bunch of push-ups and then you eat a chicken breast and your body goes, oh, that's perfect. Put that right here. Like unfortunately that is not as simple as everything is. Otherwise we would all start growing feathers. But you take a chicken breast, you break it down into amino acids and fatty acids. You're not really going to get any carbohydrates from a chicken breast, but it's going to take the proteins and the fats and break them down until they're not even proteins anymore. They're the building blocks that make up proteins. We call those amino acids, right? And that way, your body can reassemble them into a U-shaped thing, like into something that is, Cyrus shaped, or, something that's Danny shaped, or, Simon shaped, right? Like it's just going to kind of build it into like whatever makes up you, right? And those building up actions are the other half of your metabolism called anabolic reactions or anabolism, right? When we take something very simple and we build it up into something complex, that's an anabolic reaction. So, when you were being made, originally, like, catabolic reactions broke everything down into chemicals, and then your body was assembled, chemical by chemical into cells, into a bunch of tissues, into a bunch of organs, until eventually it ended up with a whole, organ system, and eventually that ended up with a whole like organism, and so that's sort of where we came from. Like a series of anabolic reactions kept happening to build us up, right? And thanks to like our mother's catabolic, reactions, we were able to get those individual components. So you'll often hear this phrase, catabolism fuels anabolism, right? Catabolic reactions allow us to have anabolic reactions because they give us the ingredients that we need. So when we're talking about this, right, we've got these sort of two different sections. Like every metabolic reaction we're talking about is either catabolic or anabolic. There's constantly a balance here, right? It's like a really, it's like a bank account that gets used very, very often. You're constantly depositing funds and then emptying those funds and depositing funds and emptying those funds, right? Like that's sort of a balance there. And so we have a term for that balance. We call it homeostasis, but there's also a lot of other things that are part of homeostasis. Yeah, catabolically and anabolically balancing those things out. It's a big part of homeostasis, right? Your body's main job is to maintain homeostasis. So when you are, let's say, catabolically breaking stuff down on like a fat loss routine, right? Let's say you're like, hey, I want to lose 10, I want to lose 15 pounds, right? Well, you need to catabolically break down some of your body's tissues in order to reduce those tissues inside the body and lose some of your fat, right? So what ends up happening is you eat in like a caloric deficit. You actually eat out in a way that is outside of homeostasis. Now, what ends up happening is your body goes, well, I can't just stop running. You didn't give me the 500 calories that I needed today, but I can't just like stop running. So what it has to do is your body has to find a way to maintain homeostasis by tapping into other body tissues, primarily fat tissue, right? So your body taps into your fat stores, pulls 500 calories worth of energy out, and now it burns all that up to sort of maintain you and all the activity that you're doing. And so you just tapped in and burned 500 of the calories worth of energy that you had stored inside of your body. And once you've done 3,500 calories worth, so if that was like 500 a day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, there's 7 days, that's 3,500 calories. You just lost 1 pound of fat because your body had to maintain homeostasis by eliminating certain tissues. And that's what fat's for. So it got it from your fat tissue. Now, if you stay outside of homeostasis for too long, or if you do it too extreme, your body can start tapping into other types of tissues, which is something that we're trying to avoid. It can tap into your muscle tissue, and it can catabolize your muscle tissue. And then suddenly you have less muscle tissue, which is great for your body, or great in your body's opinion, I should say, right? Because your body goes, well, now it's way easier to maintain homeostasis, right? Like we were in a calorie deficit. I just ate some of the muscle away. Now I don't burn as many calories, right? So it's easier to maintain it's easier to maintain balance, right? But we don't want that to happen, right? We want to have lots of muscle mass because that translates to other things, more athleticism, health, posture, all kinds of really good things. So it is a tricky, journey sometimes helping people lose weight because we're trying to help them burn into their fat stores without tapping in too much into their muscle stores. And so that's where the, understanding this metabolism stuff becomes really handy, So your body is constantly trying to maintain homeostasis. And anytime you get outside of that homeostasis, your body is going to try to get you back to neutral, right? Think of homeostasis as neutral, right? So let's use your blood sugar as an example, right? Your body, you eat like a bunch of carbohydrates, right? Actually, I don't need to do that because I got a picture coming. You eat a bunch of carbohydrates, a lot of sugar in particular, right? You have a donut or something like that, right? And so a whole bunch of sugar is now floating in your blood. And unfortunately, your body doesn't operate that well when there is that much sugar running through your blood. So your body, you've bumped your blood sugar levels outside of homeostasis. So now your body is going to go, well, I want to get us back to homeostasis here. I want to get us back to neutral. So what it will do is it will do a process called negative feedback. Now, negative feedback describes how our body gets back to a source form. It describes how our body gets back to neutral, right? So negative feedback is reversing a condition from outside of normal back to normal, okay? So the best analogy for this is a thermostat. Okay, so a thermostat, let's say like your room temperature falls to 66 degrees, but you have the thermostat set to 70, right? So the thermostat goes, is it 70 degrees? Oh, no, it is not. All right, we are too cold. So what it'll do is it'll kick the heater on, right? And then the heater is going to raise the temperature of the room and it'll get 66, 67, 70. right? Once it gets to like 70 degrees, the thermostat's going to kick the heater off because it'll be like, great, I have returned back to what I am set at. That's how your body is, right? So we go back to our blood sugar example, right? Let's say, this is actually looking at your body temperature here, but let's say like your blood sugar levels get far beyond sort of what they are supposed to be. Your body will use negative feedback to drive your blood sugar levels back to normal. And the way it does that is it uses this hormone called insulin, right? And so insulin is released by this organ called your pancreas. The pancreas releases a bunch of insulin that pulls pulls sugar out of your blood until your blood sugar levels get back to neutral. Now, if you make too much insulin, unfortunately, it'll drop too low. And then your body goes, all right, well, now I have no sugar in the blood and I am starving of blood sugar. So then it'll give you hunger cravings, which is an example of negative feedback to get you back to regular blood sugar levels. And this is part of like why people sometimes have a really hard time controlling their blood sugar, because they'll eat a whole bunch of food, they'll kind of overeat, or they'll eat like a really high sugar food. And that'll cause their blood sugar levels to spike. And then they don't, they have so much sugar in their blood, their body releases a ton of insulin, which drives too much sugar out of their blood because they created way too much insulin. That causes their blood sugar levels to crash through the floor. And then all of a sudden their body is doing negative feedback to say, oh my God, I am so hungry. Give me more blood sugar. So then it causes hunger hormones. And then you go eat like another big sugary meal. And it becomes very difficult to manage your blood sugar. It should be moving kind of like this, right? But instead we're getting these like big crashing waves, because we are not maintaining our levels the way we should. So here's an example of that, right? We take in food that raises our glucose levels. The pancreas releases insulin. Insulin drives the sugar out of our blood. And then our blood sugar levels are back to normal. But let's say they get a little bit lower than they're supposed to. So then you're going to get like hunger, right? And then that's going to cause food intake, which will sort of repeat this whole process. So that's negative feedback, right? If your body temperature gets too low, your body will use negative feedback to make you start shivering so your body temperature gets back to neutral. If you get too hot, your body will start sweating to pull the heat off. To get you back to neutral. All of those things are examples of negative feedback. It's your body trying to return to a source. There is also positive feedback. Positive feedback intensifies a response. This is a little bit, much less common, really. But let's say your body, actually, diabetes is a really good example of this, right? Let's say your pancreas creates insulin. And that's supposed to drive the sugar out of your blood. What type 2 diabetes is it's where the body cells have actually become resistant to insulin as a hormone, so it doesn't work quite as well. So you create insulin, it doesn't work, right? So then what happens is your body goes, hey, we need way more insulin. So then it intensifies the response, right? That's positive feedback, right? Doesn't happen quite as often, ideally your body will sort of work the way it's supposed to, but like if something didn't actually work, positive feedback will keep intensifying it and intensifying it. Another example of positive feedback actually is if you ever sit on your leg and pinch like the nerves in your leg and you don't really know that you're pinching the nerves in your leg. Well, your nervous system will try to communicate with your leg. It'll be like, hey, leg. You don't really feel it. And they'll be like, all right, leg, and start screaming, right? And then all of a sudden you start to feel a tingle in your foot. And you're like, oh, I'm sitting on my leg. And all of a sudden you move and because your foot has fallen asleep, right? That's actually an example of positive feedback where it was like, leg, leg, leg. And then all of a sudden your leg's like, what? And then you're feeling all that tingling and it's, you're stuck in the war between your brain and your foot. So that's an example of sort of positive feedback there. So that is sort of a big chunk on the beginning half of this. Any questions so far, guys? How's everybody feeling? We talked a little bit about metabolism, but we're moving into directional terms. We're going to have a sort of a tone shift here. Any questions, comments, or concerns so far?
Nope.
Not for me, no.
All righty, feeling pretty good. So next thing we're gonna talk about here, let's take a look at our directional terms, right? So earlier, like I said, one thing that drives anatomists crazy is where someone's like, well, from my perspective, it's this. We don't want to have that argument, right? We do not want to have that conversation when we're talking about directional terms. For those of you, I think actually it's just going to be Dion. Yeah, just Dion and Arlene here. Oh, wait, Chris, maybe you were part of that month. Anyway, those of you who have been through kinesiology, right, with me, one time, sometimes we always talk about like internal, whenever we're talking about like the differences between like internal shoulder rotation or external shoulder rotation, right? You'll hear me say like internal versus external. A lot of times people will, I'll sometimes hear this argument where, we're looking at the difference between external rotation and internal rotation. People go, well, it's a circle, right? It's a circle. So like, technically internal is external because if you go all the way around, eventually it becomes internal again. So, technically there's no such thing as internal versus external rotation. I've heard that argument before, and it is a dumb argument. That is not how that works. Yes, a circle is sort of like, infinite in a way. But the thing is, thanks to the way we have studied anatomy, we have a starting point. We know what the starting point is. And because I know what the starting point is, if it's going away from the starting point, that's external. And if it's going towards the starting point, that's internal. And there is no argument here, right? That is why we have our directional terms so specifically. All of these directional terms are going to come from what we call the anatomic position, okay? So the anatomic position is this. It is standing erect, so standing straight up with the palms facing forward, feet at like underneath the hips, toes point forward. This right here is the anatomic. Good Lord, look at that face. This is like, will I murder you? That is terrifying. This is the anatomic position right here. It is literally standing with the palms facing directly forward. I'm pulling up a different photo because that one freaks me out. That's what we're talking about, right? So I am standing right now in the anatomic position. My toes are forward. They're directly under my hips. This is not the anatomic position, right? My hands with my sides like this, with my thumbs kind of going forward, right? That is not the anatomic position. This is the anatomic position, okay? So when I say the head is superior to everything else in the body, the reason I know that that is true is because it is above everything else when I'm standing in the anatomic position. So if I were doing a handstand right now, my head is still superior in general because from the anatomic position, it is the most upper portion of the body there, right? So these are our directional terms. And these directional terms, when there's no other direction given, you assume the anatomic position, okay? So now, these are really great flashcard terms. For those of you who, are struggling with sort of the kinesiology terms, if you're worried about understanding like which muscle does what and things like that, these are really great terms to kind of get into your vocabulary and get used to using so that you can sort of talk the talk. Whenever we're describing like what an exercise is, right? We need to understand the anatomy and the kinesiology of it, how it actually moves, right? So for instance, a squatting motion is referred to as like triple extension, okay? What I mean, the reason we call it a triple extension exercise is because you are performing extension in 3 body parts simultaneously, okay? So when you squat, doing a squat jump here, there we go. When you squat, what you're actually doing when you go down, right, into the lowest portion of the squat there. I'm gonna go ahead and take this, right? What she's doing right here is she's creating an angle from here and from here that is different from what it was before, right? Like right here, it's kind of a right angle, right? So she's taking this and making it a much sharper angle. This ankle movement here is what is known as dorsiflexion. Okay, so dorsiflexion is decreasing this angle in the knee joint, right? Or in the ankle joint. Well, the same thing is true here, right? Here's an angle that's really flat, right? Between the knee there, right? Versus like what's happening in the hip now, it's a sharp angle like that, right? So that's a much sharper angle now. That is hip flexion, right? Actually, let me get rid of that one. So there's hip flexion, right? It went from being very flat to being very sharp, right? And then at the exact same time, it's happening. Oh, I did the hips in that. Whoops. I did the hips here. I meant to go like this. There's the knees, right? That's becoming a very sharp angle right there. So she's got knee flexion, and then she's got hip flexion as well. So she got hip flexion, knee flexion, and dorsiflexion. Those are all flexion examples. So when she's coming out of the squat, you know what she's doing? She's doing plantar flexion here, which is exactly the opposite. She's doing extension in the knee, and she's doing extension in the hip. So all three of those things are happening simultaneously. Extension, extension, extension. That's why this is called a triple extension movement. Kind of complicated stuff, which is why we're actually not talking about flexion or extension today. But understanding that, like, you know, those things have to be labeled in a way that we can all speak the same language. We don't want to leave any room for interpretation, right? We don't want to have any room for interpretation, because then all of a sudden, like, we take this squat action, right? This is called triple extension. Well, what about like a lunge, right? Well, a lunge is also triple extension. There's really no difference between like this and then like being in this position here, right? My front leg is doing exactly the same thing it did during the squat, right? So that's still a triple extension movement, which is why squats and lunges are very similar. Now, if we look at like a deadlift, it's a little bit different, right? A deadlift, which let's say it's a Romanian deadlift, right? Where I really kind of kick my butt out, you know, I'm still doing triple extension, but I'm putting way more emphasis on what's going on in my glutes, right? My glutes are doing most of the work. So the deadlift is also triple extension, but the distribution of like where certain muscles are working, right? There's a little bit of a difference there, right? I would say a deadlift is a little bit more hamstring and glute focused, whereas a squat is a little bit more quad and glute focused, right? The glutes work in both times. And you're going to get a lot more calf work in a squat as well. So don't worry about absorbing too much of that. That's really just meant to be kind of my framework to kind of show you. We want to start basic with our directional terms, and we can build from there. And once we understand these, we can get a little bit more complex with things, right? So the directional terms are a standardized set. We have a starting position, right? A standardized set of terms used by health and fitness professionals to describe where certain things are on the body, right? So superior is above a point of reference, right? And this moves like vertically, right? So if we kind of go to paint here, right? I'm just going to kind of draw like a big circle here, right? So this is sort of how we kind of want to think of the body here. Let's just say we've got sort of the middle of the circle here. I got the middle of the circle here, right? We got the middle of the circle here, right? So that's the middle, and then this right here would be the center. A little bit different, right? So there's the center there, right? So anything above this line right here that moves like vertically, we're going to call that superior, right? So anything going like this way, we're going to consider that superior, right? And then anything that's going this way down below it, we're going to call that inferior, right? So everything above the line is superior and everything below the line is inferior in general, right? Now, obviously, I can like refer to things a little bit more specifically, right? I could say like, well, my nose is superior to my mouth, but it's inferior to my forehead, right? And then all of a sudden I have like more than one point of reference. Great, I can, I can use that language that way as well. Guys, by the way, for the record, if you are trying to memorize this stuff, it is way easier to memorize them, like light and dark, up and down, left and right. You kind of opposite, memorize the opposites. That makes this way easier. So superior's opposite is inferior, right? Superior is above, inferior is below, and that only moves like vertically up and down. I'm going to come back to anterior and posterior. We'll come back to this one in just a minute. We've also got like medial versus lateral. So medial and lateral. Medial is closer to the midline, okay? So medial is going to look like this, right? If we're going closer to the midline, that's going to be medial, okay? Versus the opposite of that, which would be like lateral, right? So if I go away from the midline, that would be lateral, right? So now you can kind of even see it in like the arrows here, right? Like these arrows are facing in opposite directions. Well, these arrows are also facing in opposite directions. So that's going to be lateral. I'll put this here. That is hard to read. So there's lateral, right? So medial is close to the midline, right? And this could be like, for instance, like you start with my nose, which is very medial, right? It is pretty much centered right here. But then like my eyes get more lateral, off to the side. I can't remember who it was, but like I remember when I was first learning these terms, one of my teacher who was like kind of going through it, he talked about, I can't remember who it was, but he's a famous basketball player back in like the 70s or 80s. And his eyes were super lateral on the side of his head. And they also like stuck out a little bit further. So they'd be a little bit more anterior as well. We'll get to anterior and posterior in just a second. But like, because of that, he could see like behind himself, like really easily. And they had to like in practice, if anybody knows what I'm talking about, by the way, please chime in because I can't remember who this player was. They had to actually like practice specifically like catching passes from him because he was notorious for like dribbling down like a lane and then like not looking backwards so no one would know, and then just passing the ball back to one of his teammates and like they were wham and like hit him in the face because they wouldn't see it coming. And it was because he could like see a little bit better because like it was a little bit more lateral. He could see around the side of his head, and a little bit more anterior, so he had a little bit of a wider perspective there. But that's sort of how this works, right? Like my eyes are lateral, my nose is very medial, right? And that moves horizontally. So now we've got vertical and we've got horizontal terms. We do also have like on the front side of things versus on the back side of things, right? So if we had, let me see if I can, oh, no, I can't do anterior versus posterior, right? If I had like a cube, we got the front, actually I can't, I really can't draw this. But anterior versus posterior, right? Anterior is going to be on the front of the body and posterior is going to be on the back of the body, right? So anterior is like my face, posterior is like the back of my head. My chest is anterior, my glutes are posterior, right? Which is one of the things that sort of makes them opposites of one another, right? My chest is anterior, my upper back is posterior, my hip flexors are anterior, my glutes are posterior. So those are the different terms in terms of like where stuff is located on the body, right? This is where Simon, you might remember this from last night. Chris, you might remember this from, I'm sorry, Simon, you might remember this from yesterday. Chris, you might remember this from last night. We talked about the difference between like an anterior chain workout and a posterior chain workout. An anterior chain workout would be like push-ups, plus maybe like a shoulder press, plus like bicep curls, walking lunges, or maybe like a step up. and then like an anterior tibialis thing, plus like lots of like crunches and stuff. It's all the anterior stuff on the body. If you put a workout together like that, and that was like your A day, and then you put a posterior workout, which is like your upper back, your posterior deltoid, triceps, glutes, hamstrings. That's a posterior chain sort of approach, right? And there's your workout A and your workout B, and they would sort of complement each other. Maybe it's like anterior on Monday, posterior on Tuesday, anterior again on Thursday, posterior again on Friday. That's one way to sort of split things up. So anterior is on the front, posterior is on the back. And then lastly, we've got two terms that sometimes give people trouble here, which is proximal versus distal. So proximal versus distal, unfortunately, I got to make my own arrow this time. So proximal is going to be anything nearest the center, right? So proximal is actually going to be this. We're going to see it go in directly like this direction here. So proximal sort of works in a couple different directions simultaneously, right? It's just going towards the center, right? Like in this version, it's going, because I was below and sort of off to the side, right? I'm going a little bit superior and a little bit medial at the same time. I'm going towards the center. That's proximal. Versus distal, which is sort of doing the opposite of that, right? Distal is going away from the center. Those are way too close to each other, aren't they? Hold on, let's put proximal over here. Versus like distal, which is over here, right? So if I'm going towards the center of my body, that's proximal. Oftentimes when we're describing like the arms and the legs, we'll use proximal and distal as our terms, right? So like my wrist is more proximal than my fingers because it's closer to my center, right? It would take, if you were to draw with a marker, it would take less ink than if you were to come from my fingers all the way there, right? So like my fingers are very distal, my wrist is a little bit more proximal than that, but my wrist is still distal compared to my elbow, which is more proximal than that, right? So usually we use those terms whenever we're going in any direction we want. So we've got superior, inferior, lateral, medial, proximal, distal, right? And those sort of go at angles and stuff. Any question? And there's some pictures there, right? Superior, inferior, anterior, posterior, proximal and distal, and then medial towards the midline, lateral. So there is sort of a difference here, right? Oftentimes people mess up proximal and distal with medial and lateral. Medial is going towards the middle. Proximal is going towards the center. So that's kind of the difference there, right? There's sort of a difference between those two terms there, right? You have a middle line here and here. You have a center is where those two middles meet. Everybody pretty good on that? Questions or comments on our directional terms? These are the type of things that make really good homework questions. So like, I want to make sure these are pretty clear because you probably get a question on that. Solid. Okay. What's that, Danny?
No.
Oh, you're
Everything's
all right. So the last thing we're going to look at today are our planes of motion. Okay. So we also have like, where motion generally takes place. We have sort of like three main spots where motion is going to occur. This becomes pretty important for us as personal trainers, considering that like we really want to move our clients through the correct plane of motion. Certain joints are really only designed to primarily move in one direction. And so then all of a sudden we screw up our posture and they're moving in planes that they're really not supposed to. And we start to run into problems, So your planes of motion are these three imaginary planes that are dividing the body at right angles, right? So we can actually do it with this, sort of circle that I wrote, right? I kind of divided this way, right? And I kind of divided this way. So if I like moved, if like, let's say I had a, something like this, and I was moving it like up and down like this, right? That is very much moving in what we would call the sagittal plane, right? Versus if I had an arrow that was kind of moving like this, right? That is very much moving in what we would call the transverse plane. And then because it's a circle, if I were to move sort of side to side in another way, we call that the frontal plane. So let's take a look at the body as an example here, right? So if you were to cut me into a left side and a right side. So if something divided me down the middle like this, right? Straight down. And so there's a sheet of glass going through this way, and it's going, that way. It's going straight through me in both directions, like here, right? These motions kind of like this are what we refer to as sagittal motions, right? I'm gonna take my leg here and I go like this, right? I'm doing very sagittal plane movements. So like bicep curls are a sagittal plane movement because they're going front to back, right? Push-ups, right, are with my elbows tucked are very sagittal, right? Crunches are very sagittal. Back extensions are very sagittal, like glute kickbacks, right? Squats, lunges. There are a ton of sagittal exercises out there. And for the most part, we kind of live our life doing a lot of sagittal movements in general, right? Like if I'm walking around, I'm walking straight forward. It's a very sagittal movement, right? So this is the one that not a lot of our clients really have too many problems with. It's also the one that most exercises are kind of based around. So we've created like a lot of workout routines that focus on the thing that we're good at. It's kind of the opposite of how training works, right? We kind of want to do things that we are not good at, So let's take a look at these other two planes of motion. If you were to divide me into a front half and a back half, right? So if you were to like slice me down the side like this, and now I've got a front side and I got a back side, and I do motions like this, right? Where I'm going like doing this kind of thing or this kind of thing, right? Side to side movements, right? I feel like I'm mine. Lateral twist, side to side bending like this. All of that kind of stuff is moving in what we call the frontal plane, because you can see the front and you can see the back, right? Sagittal plane, you can see the left and the right. Frontal plane, you can see the front and the back. So I move along the plane, right? These are frontal plane movements, whereas these are sagittal plane movements. So my head is a really good example of something that can actually do both, right? My head can sagittally go up and down, right? And it can frontally go side to side, right? Or even just like that kind of shift. I'm not very good at that, but that is also a frontal plane movement, right? Anything that's kind of moving side to side there. And lastly, we've got the transverse plane, which is going to cut things into an upper and a lower half. So if you were to divide me like right here, and I did like a twist, right? Like my feet are still facing this way, but I twist like this, right? That's a transverse plane movement, right? Or like external rotation versus internal rotation, right? This twisting action is moving in the transverse plane. So when someone rolls their ankle and they sprain their ankle, a lot of times it's because they weren't very good at moving in the transverse plane. And we should be able to, people tear, oh, did anybody figure out what happened to Odell Beckham? Oh, I meant to look this up. Where did he get injured? It was an ACL. Yeah, 100%. So we were sitting there watching the Super Bowl, and he landed. And let's see if we can watch that play. Actually, let's see if here's the replay.
You got a voice, Molly.
I'm recording this. There's like no way that this is not going to get copyright struck now that I'm showing something for the freaking NFL. They're going to get me. But let's watch this play here real quick and we'll see what happens. Come on, come on, come on. And there it is. Like he got hurt. Let's see if there's the replay. Poor guy. I feel that sucks. Oh, they're not showing the zoomed in replay. They're just, ugh. Okay. Let's play this in slow motion so we can actually see it. So zooming in here. So here comes the ball. And oh, that is so difficult to see. This is already on HD. So see how he's like up on one leg and then he's going to land and he's twisting here. He was landing with a twisted leg and that's where he tore his ACL. So your ACL is tied at an angle like this. And then you have your PCL like that. And they create like this crossing action. So when you land with a straight leg as you are twisting, right? If you do this like big kind of twist like this, that's a transverse movement. It stretches the ligaments. And if they're not strong enough to hold on, that ACL ligament will tear. And a lot of times they can do surgery on it and rehab it. It's not really that big a deal. I mean, it's not great, but like, you know, a lot of times they can kind of fix that sort of thing. But that's why that happened, right? I'm not saying I am, you know, going to train Odell Beckham Jr., but if he had done maybe a little bit more transverse plane movements in that knee, that could be the type of thing that might have prevented that injury. So the transverse plane is the twisting stuff. So we go back to my, like, look at our head as an example. It can do all three planes of motion. It can do sagittal and frontal. It can do, sagittal and frontal. And it can do transverse, right? So if I'm dividing it into an upper lower half, right? And I move along the cut, right, at that side to side twisty stuff, right? So your knee joint really isn't meant to do too much frontal plane movement, but it can do a little bit of transverse movement, but it can do a ton of sagittal movement, right? Like our knee primarily does mostly like sagittal stuff, right? It's got a huge range of motion there. It can do a little bit of transverse stuff, right? See, I can like twist from the knee down there, but from the knee up, I cannot do frontal plane movements. If I want to do like, if I want to like go side to side like this, I literally cannot at the knee joint. But what I can do is I can kind of twist, which you're seeing like me do transverse. So not every joint can do every plane of motion. That's part of how our body is designed specifically. So us understanding the anatomy of how our bones are sort of shaped and understanding the kinesiology of how they are meant to move is one of the best ways for us to know how to train our clients to either rehabilitate them from an injury or you know, prevent them from getting an injury. And that's why posture becomes like such an important part of our conversation. And that's actually about it today, guys. The rest of that, we got some anatomy terms here at the end, but they don't really apply to us. This is actually like a very medical textbook. A lot of the chapters we are going to skip because they're not really relevant to our industry. But everything today hopefully helped you have a little bit of an understanding on how to sort of like speak the language. You know, I want to wrap up here and ask you guys if you got any questions before I sort of let you go today. Danny and Cyrus, I'm going to keep you guys for just a moment, just so we can kind of recap and make sure you're feeling confident, walk you through how class is going to work and stuff. But before I do that, before I kind of kill the recording here, any questions, guys? Everybody feeling questions, comments, concerns?
No questions.
Nope. All right. So let me kill the recording.